introduce our speaker, I just wanted to briefly explain the structure. Explain the structure of the webinar. As teachers working with plurilingual learners, often much of our attention is directed towards those learners who are at the earlier stages of English language proficiency, supporting them to make accelerated progress in order to help them catch up with their peers. Today, though, we're shifting the focus to those learners who have already reached bands C, D and E and are often assumed to be independent learners, but who may have plateaued in terms of their language development. Tom will consider how the Bell Foundation Assessment Framework can be used for both assessment and target setting. It's an ambitious webinar, and I'll leave it to Tom to tell you about his plans for developing from it. If there's time at the end, we'll be taking questions. So as I've said, if you have got any, just pop them into the Q&A box and I'll collate those and share them with Tom at the end. Tomorrow, as you know, you'll receive an email from us with a link to access the video recording of this webinar. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Tom. Tom joined the Bell Foundation in 2020, but has worked in language education since 2003, having taught in China, Japan, Ecuador, and North Africa. His main areas of interest are teaching young learners, project-based learning, and teacher development. He holds an MA in anthropological linguistics and is CELTA and Delta qualified. He has worked as a teacher trainer in the UK and abroad as a regular speaker at English language teaching conferences. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, let's crack on. Let's get started. So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us from all the different places. As always, it's lovely to get people from around the world. And as Caroline mentioned, this webinar came out of the fact that you know, we've been running our Language Results International program for a little while now, and something that is definitely noticeable in comparison to our UK-based program is that we get a lot more queries from teachers working with plurilingual learners at higher levels of English proficiency. So we wanted to sort of address that in a little bit more detail today. And this is what we intend for you to get out of today's session. I'll let you read the slide. Okay, and this is how we're going to get there today. We're going to focus a little bit on why we should be supporting our more advanced learners. Then we're going to look in more detail at the framework at bands C to E, and look at perhaps why they might be more tricky to work with than the lower bands, and how we can make them clearer to both our students and to the teachers who work with them. And then we're going to move on to looking at a process for using the bands to assess and set targets for our more advanced learners. And in particular, we're going to focus and take some examples from speaking and writing, since these are the two areas that we tend to explicitly assess. And I hope there'll be time for questions at the end, as we mentioned, but you can ask questions at any point in the Q&A box. Also, I wanted to mention, as you can see in this webinar, the focus is very much on understanding and using the framework document itself to assess learners, in particular to set targets, which is, you know, the most important function really of the framework. Originally, I had planned to also talk about classroom strategies that we can use for developing the language of advanced learners, but it really quickly became obvious that there wasn't going to be time or space to do justice in this particular webinar. So I'm going to be doing a partner webinar to this one later in the year, which is going to specifically focus on classroom strategies that we might use with our more advanced plurilingual students. Okay, just to make that clear. So I haven't forgotten about it. It's just that we're going to push that into a different webinar. I'm going to put up another quick poll now, because I just wanted to quickly explain a little bit about the EAL assessment framework for schools. I'll assume that many of you will be familiar with it. So if you could just put in the poll what your experience of using the assessment framework is. The other thing to mention is you might find it useful to have a copy of the framework to hand, either online or in paper, although it's by no means necessary. It just might be, you might find it useful to refer to. So if you have it, if you do use it in your school and you want to pop and get a copy, the next couple of slides are just going to be me talking about what the framework is. So you've got some time to do that. Just for anyone who's less familiar, I'll do a very quick overview now. Can you show the results, please, Lacey? The poll. Okay, so there's a handful of you that haven't really heard it, and probably a majority that don't use it but have heard of it. Okay, perfect. Well, in that case, the next couple of slides will be useful to most of you. So the framework exists in both primary and secondary forms. And is divided into 4 domains of listening, speaking, reading and viewing, and writing. By separating the 4 domains, obviously it helps teachers better focus on strengths and areas for development in each individual area for each student. And there are 5 proficiency bands, working up from A, which is new to English, to E, which we describe as fluent. And each domain has a set of 10 descriptors at each band. So you'll see across the top, band A, B, C, D, and E, and then there's 10 descriptors within each band. And a few things you should know is that those earlier in the band show early development. Those later in the band are getting closer to the next band. But it's really important that we don't really expect these to be achieved in order. You know, language development is too messy, and every individual is different. So this is just very approximate. It's not expected that they go A 1 2 3 4 5, then B 1 2 3 4 5, or anything like that. And as you can see from this example, these are some speaking descriptors at, I think, band A. And so the very first one is quite basic, you know, can produce single words and phrases. And then it moves through to, if you look at sort of 9 and 10 there, you can see that it's a little bit more complex. That's basically the structure of the framework. So why then is it useful to focus on these higher proficiency learners? Well, first of all, here are the 5 proficiency bands that I just mentioned that we're using, and these are aligned with the descriptors that were that are used by the UK or the English Department for Education, and research that was carried out by the University of Oxford in collaboration with the Bell Foundation tells us that learners operating at band C and above achieve at or above the UK national average academically. Okay. This is across subjects and across year groups. I think Caroline will pop a link to the report in the comments if you're interested in more detail. But you'll notice that learners at band C are very close to the national average. And I think what's interesting is that this is the proficiency level at which many schools will stop offering kind of targeted support for targeted EAL support. And then students will be placed into their mainstream lessons and often kind of left to sort of sink or swim. But I think what this shows us is that if we want them to really achieve their potential, their academic potential, then support is going to be required right up to and including band E. And what this data suggests is that the higher their language proficiency, the better students are going to achieve academically, which, you know, may seem obvious, but it's worth stating. So we owe it to our students to make sure that they become as proficient as possible during their time studying with us. Another thing to notice is how long it takes for students to reach fluency. So again, research from the UK and from Steve Strand at the University of Oxford gives us some pretty solid indicators of how long it generally takes students to develop language proficiency. So to go from A to E, we know it takes on average 6 or more years. Okay. And that's regardless of when they enter the school. It's going to take them on average about 6 or more years to become fully proficient. And again, I can offer you the Caroline just shared that report if you want more information. And in an international school context, where I think it's common for learners to spend time in intensive EAL support programs before moving over to mainstream lessons, it's really important that we reinforce to teaching staff, to school leadership, and to teachers that, you know, a couple of years of intensive language support is not sufficient to achieve mastery of English. It's great to get students up to the level where they can start learning and take part with their more proficient peers in the classroom, but it's not sufficient, and some level of support is still going to be needed, even for competent and fluent learners, if they're going to achieve the language level that will allow them to achieve their potential, maximize their potential in the curriculum. So I think that's an important message. And finally, I wanted to use this idea of the language learning plateau, which if anyone's familiar with kind of English language teaching, is quite a common idea. It comes from an academic called Jack Richards. And this is the idea that learners tend to increase in proficiency very quickly initially until they reach a certain level, which Richards suggests is sort of what he describes as upper intermediate, higher intermediate. If you're using the common European frame of reference, we're looking at sort of upper B1, B2 level. At this level, for various reasons, it seems that progress can often slow down or even stop completely. And he identifies a number of possible problems that learners can encounter. And I think they can all be made relevant to our context if we think about them. So first of all, he notices that there can be a gap between receptive and productive competence. By receptive, I mean listening and reading, and productive, speaking and writing. So he describes this as learners who have made greater progress in listening and reading, but are less competent in speaking and listening. And I think in some cases that is true, particularly in situations where children have perhaps learned English primarily via formal education, perhaps in a home language education context, and then they've come into an international context. However, in international education, we also know from experience, of course, that younger learners, and especially those that have been in English medium education from early years, where they get a lot of exposure to English, they can have very different profiles. So often we might find that these learners actually have really well developed speaking and listening skills, but they may struggle with perhaps their reading and writing, particularly in more academic contexts. So whatever the profile, whatever the student profile, we need to focus support on these areas, the areas that students will find most challenging. And of course, that's going to vary according to your context, which of course is why we recommend using the framework or other assessment tools so that you can identify where the support is needed. Another thing that can sort of slow progress is this, is that fluency will progress at the expense of complexity, which refers to learners having, you know, this basic repertoire of commonly used grammar and vocabulary, which does most of the things they need. And especially where they've developed skills where they can express meaning even in situations where they don't have the specific words or structures. You know, they can find ways around it. So this means that they haven't acquired, or they don't use the more complex and sophisticated language patterns and usage characteristics typically of highly proficient learners. And I think here it's really important that we don't confuse fluency with proficiency. We've all met those really gregarious students who will talk and talk and talk, and can be really effective communicators, but you know, when you listen closely, they're actually quite limited in terms of the accuracy of the language and the grammar they're using, and their range of language is quite limited, even though they're really skilled communicators. And again, those kind of learners may often have what we call spiky profiles. So their speaking might be really fluent, but perhaps their reading and their writing skills aren't at the same level. So again, targeted support is required. we also find that these learners at these upper levels can have a sort of limited vocabulary range. So they've learned all the higher frequency vocabulary items, but they haven't yet acquired the more nuanced and low frequency vocabulary. And obviously in a school context, this is particularly relevant to academic language. So if you're familiar with the vocabulary tiers that people like Gibbons talk about, then it's common for learners at this stage to have mastered what we call the tier 1 vocabulary, which is sort of commonly occurring everyday language, but they're still learning tier 3, which is the academic jargon, and especially the tier 2 language, which is the more generic kind of academic higher register language that they encounter. So support's going to be needed there. And this is something that Richards notes, and bear in mind, he's coming from the world of adult English language teaching, which is very different to what to our context. And he points out a common problem is that language production, whilst fluent and grammatical, can lack the characteristics of natural speech and may be too formal. That's what I would call using textbook English. However, in an international education context with children and younger learners, where English is the main medium of instruction, I actually think that we may see this problem, but we're also just as likely to see the opposite, which is that language production tends to be too informal. And I think we've all seen this, particularly with student writing, is that they will tend to transfer their spoken skills, which are quite well developed, into their writing. And it will be too informal for academic purposes. And of course, it's because learners will tend to acquire the common speech patterns of communicative English first, and then they apply those to situations where it may not be appropriate. And again, the key point is that learners may settle on a style of language that's not appropriate for their context, for the context in which we want them to use it. So again, intervention is required. And lastly, another cause of this sort of language learning kind of plateau, if you like, is a sort of persistent and fossilized errors that students can get in their language. And again, we'll all have our own experiences, depending on the kind of students that we work with, of common errors that just seem to sort of persist in students' spoken and written language. And they often occur where, perhaps the meaning isn't very strongly affected by the error. For example, missing the third person S in sort of saying she go rather than she goes. But of course, the good news, I think, is that with younger learners and children, there are more opportunities to address these kind of problematic errors, as they still have, the plasticity in their brains to change. And I think where this is also really relevant in an education context, in a school context, is in the learner training that we undertake to make them able to identify and correct their own errors. Especially in written work, where it's really important that they're accurate in their language. So we can see there remain significant challenges for learners even once they've acquired a degree of fluency and are able to cope relatively straightforwardly with inclusion in mainstream lessons. So let's move on then to the framework in a little bit more depth. And here is a sample of descriptors from different bands. So you see on the left, we have a couple from band A, a couple from band B, a couple from band D, and a couple from band E. And so I'm just going to invite you to look at these two groups, the band A and band B groups, and the band D and band E groups. So the band A and band B are the new to English and emerging English, and the band D and band E are the more advanced ones. And what I wonder if you can sort of find any common characteristics or themes to the descriptors. These descriptors are taken, by the way, from all the different domains. Just take a moment to read and consider. You can write your ideas in the chat if you want, but you don't need to. Okay. So I'm going to move on. And hopefully what we can see is that the Band A and Band B descriptors tend to reference specific items of vocabulary, okay? For example, we've got like write your own name, or grammar terms, or specific grammar terms like adjectives, prefixes, suffixes. Additionally, the references to the grammar terms are generally fairly simple and probably fairly widely known, even for non-language specialists. Okay, so these are quite accessible to a wider range of people. And they tend to refer to the language at the word or sentence level. Okay, I guess up to the paragraph level, and Band B it starts talking about paragraphs. We can also see that Bands A and B tend to include a lot of specific linguistic examples of words or chunks of language that exemplify what the descriptor refers to. Whereas at the higher bands, if we have a look there, the descriptors tend to include references to more abstract uses of language. We've got things like transfer and transform, relevant explanations, arguments, and comments. This is a less well defined. This requires a little bit more sort of thought to understand what's happening. And this isn't to say that the higher band descriptors are less well written or less valid. It's simply a reflection of the leap in complexity of the language requirements as you move up the bands. And I think we can summarize the differences as follows. So at the lower bands, we've got kind of descriptors at the level of word, sentence, and paragraph. At the upper bands, it's at the level of the whole text, or what we call discourse, because if we're talking about speaking text, we can refer to that as discourse. It's got specific language items and structures at the lower bands. That's less common. At the higher bands, it tend to be more abstract references. And the lower bands includes clear linguistic item examples. So it'll give you actual clear words and phrases. And whereas at the upper bands, they do provide examples, but they tend to be more likely to be examples of like types of text or type, or the genre of text. These characteristics then, I think, make the lower bands a lot more accessible and easier to use for teaching staff, especially those who are from a non-language teaching background. But of course, we want to support teachers to use the framework at the higher bands as well. So we need then to support them to more easily map the descriptors onto examples taken from their students' language and help them to set useful and achievable language targets. So let's try and have a look and sort of see how we might demystify some of these higher band descriptors, which I think can cause a little bit of confusion, both for students and teachers. So here are some questions I think we can ask to help ourselves and our colleagues better understand and better get a feel for the higher band descriptors. Okay, this isn't in a particular order or sequence in terms of activity, but these are just ideas that we can use. So at the level, thinking about working with text at the text level. So what types of text or discourse can be used as evidence? Like what are the kind of activities or task types that we can use? We want to move from more abstract references to sort of concrete examples, because that's what helps everyone understand. So what concrete examples from curricular tasks can I find that illustrate these descriptors? Another question we can ask is, what are the language features of the text type or genre in question that I'm looking at, that I'm assessing? And I think this final question is probably the key one. So once we have a better understanding of the language features that are involved, we can then set more concrete, more measurable and achievable targets for the learner's development, and we can avoid those kind of vague, kind of nebulous language targets, which just aren't really helpful. Those of you with a linguistics background will know that the technical term for identifying the linguistic features of particular types of texts or genres is discourse analysis. And it's an entire academic discipline within linguistics in its own right, with, you know, hundreds and thousands of books and articles. But we don't need to get that technical, okay? We just need to get granular enough, I suppose, to allow teachers to set useful, clear targets and to support the learners to reach them. So we're going to look then now at some specific descriptors to illustrate what this target setting process might look like, okay? And I'm going to use examples from the speaking and writing descriptors, because I think they're the ones that we tend to assess most formally, and also they're the easiest to present in a presentation like this. So let's look at speaking to begin with. And if we look at the framework, this is the overview of band C, D, and E. And in band C, we can see that learners are beginning to be able to communicate spontaneously, although likely with lots of inaccuracies and a limited range of expression. And this is, of course, as we mentioned, is often when the kind of standalone EAL provision is withdrawn and learners tend to go into more mainstream education. It's important, again, we don't confuse fluency, verbal fluency, with proficiency, and because we know learners can be extremely fluent verbally, but adept at avoiding unknown or complex structures and avoiding vocabulary. Likewise at band E, where learners are very proficient and can manage to speak proficiency in the vast majority of school and social and classroom situations, they will still need help with nuance and extending their use of English. So if we look at the descriptors, and I sort of sat down and just focused on these upper bands, and I sort of felt that several themes kind of emerged in terms of what students are expected to do with spoken language in the classroom. And I'm going to put those up. These are all, you know, quite broad, but I think they encapsulate most of the descriptors that appear in the upper bands. And for the purposes of kind of showing you what I mean about how to deconstruct the descriptors, we're going to focus on one in particular, and that is discussing opinions, okay, which is a very common feature of classroom speaking tasks across the curriculum in I would imagine pretty much all subjects. So I'm going to show you some examples of descriptors at each band C to E that relate broadly to discussing opinions. There may be other descriptors that relate to this too, but I'm showing you these as some examples. So in band C, we can see here that the descriptors are talking about expressing belief and opinion, agreement and disagreement, and it talked about things like making comparisons and contrasts. At band D, we're still talking about expressing opinions and reactions. It talks about regarding possible solutions or what to do next. So this then is connecting this to the language of problem solving or planning. And it also mentions giving brief reasons and explanations. So that's perhaps where it's moved on from just stating an opinion to justifying opinion. And then at band D, you'll see there's a descriptor that's specifically related to explaining why something is a problem, and presenting and defending opinions in discussion. So, and this connects to spoken tasks, such as, you know, debates and so forth, and the kind of dialogue and problem solving kind of activities that often appear in especially the humanities subject and English literature and things like that. So as you can see, on the surface, these descriptors can seem to be quite similar. So we need to look more closely at how we can separate them and how each descriptor might get exemplified. Because I think again, it's quite easy to read a bit of student work and say, yeah, okay, it matches. It could be said to apply to all of these different descriptors. In which case, what band are we placing our student at? So let's go back to the questions that we talked about before. First of all, what kind of texts or activities can be used as evidence? Well, I wonder if anyone has any ideas of the kind of activities that we might want to observe as a teacher to collect evidence for meeting speaking descriptors, especially around discussing opinions. Are there any particular tasks or activities that you use in your lessons that would apply here? And if you have any, I would encourage you to just share them in the chat. And if you have absolutely no idea, that's fine too. Okay, Carolina mentions class debates, yeah, certainly. Any other ideas? Okay, a speech showing for and against a proposal, presenting a science hypothesis, presentation on topic. Okay, excellent. Yeah, so as you can see, there's loads of potential opportunities to get this kind of evidence. I'm going to just give you a few examples. These aren't exhaustive examples. These are just some examples that occurred to me. So obviously, most broadly, we're looking at group and pair work discussion tasks, I think, for when it comes to discussing opinions specifically, rather than individual presentations, because the key thing is discussing, which involves a dialogue. So more than one person is involved. So group, pair, and discussion tasks. Of course, there's loads of different kinds of these tasks. So let's look at some examples. Comparison tasks, and things like ranking or sorting tasks, like jigsaw reading, for example, where students have to move the different pieces of text to complete a whole text together. And you can see how these would link to this band C descriptor here quite nicely. Okay, we're talking about it's talking about making comparisons and contrasts. So if we want to check if the student can do that, these tasks would be kind of ideal to look at. We might also want to look at planning tasks or problem solving tasks where the students are working together discussing what we're going to do. Whether that's planning, it could be planning a science experiment, it could be some kind of problem solving task as part of a project that they're doing. And again, we can see how this might map onto this band D descriptor, where we're talking about solutions, discussing solutions and what to do next. So that would link nicely onto those types of tasks. And lastly, as I think, was it Carolina mentioned, a common activity that we do in tasks, especially in kind of humanities type of subjects, is debates. And that maps quite nicely onto the band E descriptor here of being able to defend opinions in discussions, okay, because that's a key kind of characteristic of what you need to do in a debate. So as you can see, certain task types here directly map more easily onto certain descriptors than others. However, it's important to note that there's no such thing as a band C task or a band D task. Okay, all these tasks mentioned could be completed or attempted by students at different bands. The point is to consider what task types will help you evidence the descriptors. Okay, if you're using the framework, and if there are certain tasks that link to descriptors, you may want to consider building some of those into your teaching to help you with your assessment. And also here, you can see how the framework can act as a curricular and pedagogical guide to supporting plurilingual learners, because it points teachers towards more discussion-based, student-led activities which benefit language development, as well as general cognitive development and learning. So I think this is, how the framework can also help us with sort of developing our teaching towards making it more supportive of language development in general. And again, if we get to this, we might ask ourselves, well, what examples can I find here? And obviously I can't provide with you, unfortunately, I don't have any clips or audio of concrete examples. But what I can do is discuss, how you might collect these kind of examples. So when it comes to finding examples, the key, I think, is to not focus on too many students at one time. You're looking at 1 or 2 students or a small group of students. For example, each week you could identify 1 or 2 students for whom you're going to pay attention to their speaking, and you would monitor their group discussion or their task that you've set them for a few minutes and take some notes. If you've been working online recently, as a lot of us have, recording breakout room discussions is a really good, really useful way of doing this. If you've got the time, because it's kind of there, and it's really easy to analyze. And lastly, you may also get good evidence simply by paying attention to learners during informal and incidental conversations that take place during the lesson. You might find the students to start having an argument about something, whether it's related to the curriculum or not. It's still evidence that shows that they might be able to meet some of these descriptors. And you can then enter this evidence into a progress tracker, such as the Bell Foundation tracker, which you can download for free on our website, or whichever tool that you use in your school that you prefer. So yeah, that's a way you might go around about collecting some evidence. And then, well, this is the next question. What are the language features of this text type or genre? So by observing and noticing the language that is used in the classroom in different tasks and situations, we can build up examples of successful language and awareness of what we want and what we don't want our students to be doing. And this will help us answer this question. I think when we're looking at these higher bands, it's often really useful to look at sort of functional language. And that means chunks of language or phrases that don't necessarily share a grammatical structure, but they just perform a particular language function. And I think it's a really useful way to think about language because it doesn't require any, specialist grammar knowledge or any kind of technical knowledge like that. So we can, I'm going to provide some examples. So one function, for example, would be showing agreement or disagreement, and you could exemplify it with phrases such as this. And of course, they could get more complicated and sophisticated for higher band learners. And here are some other examples as well. I'm not going to go through them all now. This isn't an exhaustive list, but it might be a useful place to start. If you Google academic language and the function that you want, you'll often find a lot of kind of very helpful resources and word lists, although be aware that a lot of the academic English resources online are aimed at tertiary education. So it might be a little bit above where your students are, but you might want to curate them and adapt them for your age group that you're working with. Feel free to share any useful resources or pages that you use for this in the chat. So yeah, functional language is really useful, and these are all functions that would be helpful when discussing your opinions. Not just the language we need to think about when students are talking, it's also skills. Here are some typical skills that are useful, again, when discussing these are conversation skills. These can't necessarily be associated with particular phrases or structures, but they are skills that can be taught and developed. And again, we haven't got time to look at strategies for that today, but that's something that we will look at later. Okay, so let's say we've got a stronger sense of what we're looking for when we're collecting evidence. The next step then is, once we've assessed our learners, is setting targets for them. Okay, so again, I think the descriptors give us a basis for setting targets, but they're often a bit broad and a bit vague. So let's look at how we can break them down. And I'm just using one descriptor at each band as an illustration here. It's okay to set targets that are really specific, I think is the first thing to say, especially for the most proficient learners, because you will find that often they can fulfill most of the criteria in a descriptor, but they might just be struggling with one aspect of it, one particular aspect. you know, perhaps they overuse a particular phrase and they need to expand their vocabulary. So let's look at C, which is the descriptor is can express belief, opinion, agreement, and disagreement politely, for example, by making comparisons and contrasts. So you might want to break this down. So if we want to move our students towards band C, we might want to give them a target such as, you know, can use a range of phrases like I think, I believe, in my opinion, to give opinions. So we're just looking at the can express belief part. And then we might want to have a separate target that looks at the comparison aspect. And again, here's some example. At band D, we're talking about expressing opinions again, reactions, but we're also talking about what to do next and giving reasons. So again, I think we could break this down. So we might want to say they can use a range of phrases, but a broader range of phrases. So we can introduce some more. So they're not just saying I think, but they're using a few more sophisticated ways of doing that. And they can do it in both formal and informal contexts. And we might want to also split this out because this descriptor talks about giving brief reasons and explanations. And I think that's, you know, we can make that a separate thing. And one of the key things they need to do that is use kind of these linking phrases, because since due to the fact that's a typo, it should be due to the fact that, not due the fact that. And lastly, at band E, we've got this descriptor talking about defending opinions. And again, I think we can split that out. So we might want to say they can give extended justification for opinions. And we want to focus on accuracy of language at this point and using the appropriate language. So it needs to be appropriately formal. And we're talking about giving explanations here as well, and arguments. And one important aspect of that is to introduce facts and ideas. And again, there's a whole lot of language that's very useful to doing that, that we might want to introduce them to. So the range of phrases such as, you know, something states that, statistics indicate that, and so on and so forth. So this is just an example of how you might want to break down descriptors to make them kind of more understandable, more manageable for both the students and for you as a teacher to understand where you develop. And obviously your strategies will be informed based on those. We can do the same thing then with our writing bands, okay? Again, here's our summary. And I think the thing to recognize here with writing in particular is that at the top end, band E and band D, you know, these are descriptors that even students who are proficient in English and have their first language as English will find challenging to reach in some cases, okay? So it's really important to recognize that simply because someone's first language is English, it doesn't automatically mean they're operating beyond our plurilingual learners in relation to a lot of these descriptors. They'll have some of the same issues and they'll have some issues that are different. It's not actually very helpful to compare our plurilingual learners to first language speakers of English. I think in a lot of cases, we should really be taking our learners, seeing them all as individuals with differing language needs. Okay. All right, so again, if we look at some of the patterns that we notice, here are some of the sort of patterns with writing. They're often connected to things like writing appropriately for different genres, using language more accurately to convey nuance of meaning. Planning is a huge issue, is a really important area, and writing cohesive and coherent extended text. And that's the one I want to focus on, because I think that's one that might be less familiar to you, again, if you haven't sort of focused on linguistics in the past. So this idea of cohesion and coherence, what are the differences? Well, cohesion is where we're looking at sort of more the micro level of text. So the ways in which elements of a text are linked together. So the conjunctions, the references, the pronouns, the micro level. I'll talk more in a minute and give you some examples. Coherence, we're looking at the bigger picture, the organization of connection of ideas across the whole text, and whether they can be understood sort of holistically by the reader. Okay, so again, we're looking more at the text level and how the text is structured as a whole, whereas the cohesion is looking at how the text is structured internally within the components. And again, we can look at we can use some examples of descriptors that map onto writing extended text. Okay, which is an obvious thing that students need to do at higher bands at secondary level. Okay, we start making them write essays, and we start off with paragraphs, and we move to longer tasks, and finally they're writing really long essays, papers, extended texts, and exam answers and things like that. We can notice again some characteristics. We've got here mentions of teacher peer support, so that's kind of a big difference. At band C, really the students still need a lot of help, basically. At the higher bands, though, one thing I noticed, like, was these two descriptors, one from band D, one from band E, and if you read them, they're really, really similar, aren't they? And so I sort of was scratching my head a little bit about what's the difference, because they almost appear to be identical. And actually, there's a couple of differences. One difference is in band D, they're talking about age appropriateness. So perhaps, obviously a 12-year-old is capable of very different things compared to a 17-year-old. And we need to take that into account. Whereas I think band E, those descriptors are kind of aimed at, by definition, the older end of the age spectrum. Students just aren't cognitively developed enough in a lot of cases to be able to achieve band E, no matter how proficient they are at language in a lot of cases. And the other thing that helped me was actually looking at the overall descriptor. So if we look at band E, it says demonstrating competence in writing accurately and independently, and it's this word independently that I think is the real differentiator between band D and band E. So at band E, we're really expecting students to do things with very little support, because the support really should be coming internally. They should be capable of editing and adapting their own texts to a large degree. Obviously with the kind of, the same scaffolding that you would provide any learner at the age appropriate level. Okay. And we can see here that they're presenting well-structured text on complex subjects. So again, the word here, complex, is kind of the key thing. We're talking, at band E, it's the level of complexity that is up to, not necessarily the language itself. It's more the topic that actually increases the level. So again, at band E, you're really probably looking at the older age groups. As you can see, at band D, it's quite similar in terms of what it's talking about linguistically, but we're talking about an attempt here. So it's not necessarily going to be fully successful. There will be problems. There will be a few things to work on. Okay. So again, we can think of what test types we can use for writing extended text. And this is fairly self-evident, isn't it? Obviously, there's things like multi-paragraph texts. That's going to help us understand this descriptor in band C. Getting in evidence from multiple genres is going to be really important, different types. That's going to help us evidence a lot of the descriptors at bands D and E, which talk about multiple different genres and different topics, range of genres, variety of topics. So we need to be collecting. We can't just collect evidence from one area. That's really clear at the higher levels. Obviously, exam answers are a really fertile area for getting evidence. They have a lot of exam questions, things like describe how far do you agree with, and things like comparative essays, and that's going to help us with assessing if students can produce detailed work and that kind of more complex work that we expect at bands D and E. Concrete examples, well, again, obviously, hopefully, writing is really easy to collect as evidence. So I'm going to show you an example that I've found to illustrate writing extended text. This was a year 11 student, and I think this was a GCSE English language exam question. This comes from one of our UK courses. This is why it's a GCSE And they were writing to argue, they were presenting an argument about the benefits and the disadvantages of being vegetarian. This is just the text I've put there is just an extract. It was actually a much longer text, but obviously I can't fit that all on the screen. But I wanted to show you how actually a quite small bit of text can give us quite a lot of insights. So we've got, let's say we've got an example. Next, we need to consider what are the language features that we're looking for. So if we want to focus on cohesion and coherence, again, here's a sort of list of things that we might be looking at. Things like reference words, the repetition of keywords and ideas, in particular, then the use of synonyms so that we're not constantly repeating ourselves. Obviously, the use of linking words and phrases is vital for cohesion and relating ideas to each other in a clear way. And we've got, simple phrases like, for example, in contrast, as a result. These are obviously, again, by no means an exhaustive list. This is just some simple ideas to kind of get us thinking in this area. Coherence, then we're looking more at the whole text again. So actually we're looking at, are the paragraphs in the appropriate sequence? Again, very basic sequences that we're all familiar with: the introduction, the body, the conclusion, the aim, hypothesis, method, and result, depending on what genre we're writing in. And obviously these can become much simpler at the younger age groups, and they get more complex as we move forward. And do the paragraphs link to each other? So this is where we're talking about, things like topic sentences and transition sentences and phrases like we can see here. We can start by discussing. Let's move on to the final point I want to make. Or this kind of language is really important to the coherence of a text. Okay. Let's look at some concrete. So let's take our example. And let's look at cohesion in particular. So first of all, in blue, we're looking at reference words. So is this student able to use pronouns? And we can see, there's a few mentions of pronouns, and there's also is that a relative pronoun? I'm not sure here whether they're trying to say whereas or whether they're trying to say where. So there's a effect on your mental health where research said on vegetarian. It's not clear. There's some use there, but it's not very well embedded throughout the text, and there are some redundant uses of it as well, which aren't necessary, although they don't harm the clarity of the text. If we look at the next bit, repeating keywords and ideas, well, I think they're quite good at this. They've got being vegetarian, vegetarianism, vegetarian diet. So we have these different phrases that I think nicely link the text. It's very clear what the student's discussing. That's quite a good strength. And then linking words and phrases, and in the yellow, we can, I think the students got some really nice language here. Not only, but also, for example, but you think this is it, which is a nice way of linking something, albeit it's probably the wrong register for a written text, but I've included it because it's something you might say in a speech. It's probably not something you would necessarily write, but it's still a nice way of linking those paragraphs. However, we can also note that the student hasn't always used this correctly, so they've got another not only at the top, but they haven't included a but also. So we can't use not only on its own. The cohesion really breaks down in that point. So I suppose I would ask you then, looking at this student's work, what band you might put them in, and it's a bit of a mean question to put you on the spot, but if we're looking at band C, D, and E, where do you think you might place this student? I've got a C coming in straight away. I mean, for those of you that have been using the framework might find this easy. If you haven't, then that's fine. It's okay. We're getting a C's, and yeah, I definitely agree with the consensus view. I think this is a band C, but they are moving into band D, definitely. I mean, there's some really nice bits of language in here which show that they're getting there, but there's too many sort of inaccuracies and issues there that they're probably still. So I definitely would give you a band C moving into band D there. There's some really strong academic language in this as well. Things like, gigantic or nice sort of language. Okay, and remember that at the higher bands, beyond band D, it's not just about the quality of the language being produced, but it's the context in which it's produced. So has the learner been able to produce it independently without a lot of scaffolding and extra support? Okay. So again, we can do our sort of exercise with the targets. I'm running a little bit short, but I'm going to show you how I might break down these descriptors. So we've got can connect simple sentences into an on-task passage and incorporate information from a different source to form an extended text, which again is a little bit vague, isn't it? And I think we need to break this down. So if we're wanting our students moving into band C to be able to evidence this, we want to see that they can link simple sentences. So we're looking at simple linking words and phrases and things like relative clauses. We also want to see that they can provide information and give examples. So again, using examples from different sources, and of course to do that they're going to need to use phrases for giving examples and to compare, like I've listed there. At band C, can produce detailed and clearly structured texts across a range of genres at an age appropriate level. Again, this is really broad, isn't it? So again, the key to making these targets more achievable, I think, is just we need to get specific. So we would say, can structure, and then insert your specific text. So, if you're a science teacher, can structure report of an experiment clearly, okay, at band D. And remember, there's a difference here between the structure and also the content. So there's mention of detail here. So we'd also want to include can write a detailed text type. So that means that they're including, sufficient information and using the right vocabulary to get the information across in detail. So, and then likewise at band E, again, the way to make these targets more specific is to relate them to both the subject specific area and the fact that students can operate independently. So we want them to say, towards band E, we want them to independently produce a clear and detailed, X, Y, or Z, whatever it is, the text type that we want them to produce, whether it's an exam answer or a written report, a piece of creative writing, whatever it might be. And again, that we can focus here on accuracy and nuance and using the appropriate language here as well. So independently producing an X, Y, and Z, but using, we want accurate at band E, we're looking at accurate and appropriate language. It's the right register. They've used words with the right correct meaning and sense and so on. Okay, I appreciate we're nearing the end. So some considerations, okay, just to leave you with. I'm afraid this probably raises more answers than it raises more questions, sorry, than it answers, but I want to help you thinking over. So things to think about. First of all, how can the framework help inform plurilingual pedagogy and curricula? So, the kind of activities as mentioned that we use to gather evidence, I think can help plurilingual and English first language learners develop. And I think we need to make sure they're included in lessons across subject areas. How can I better scrutinize the language demands of my subject? So if you're an EAL specialist, this is about how can you help your subject teachers better understand the language demands their topic offers. And if you're a subject teacher, how can you help the EAL specialists in your school understand the kind of tasks and the types of language you expect from your students so that they can support them with that and they can maybe provide some support to you as well. How can you share with colleagues, can you collate examples of work at different bands, C, D, and E, and examples that evidence certain descriptors so that people can get a stronger sense of, because what you'll find is if you do this a lot, you quite quickly can just start looking at work and you can say, oh yeah, that's a band here or that, and you start becoming much more skillful at noticing and setting targets. Which links to this. How does this get embedded into planning and target setting? How can we improve the quality of planning and target setting for our more advanced learners? I wish there was an easy answers to these questions, but it will depend on your context and how you operate as a school. You know, can you brainstorm more concrete targets that relate to the really broad high-level descriptors like I did there, to try and help teachers set more realistic targets so they're not just really vague and pointless. And how do we make sure that language support for advanced students is the responsibility of all students, because of all teachers, sorry, and the students themselves? You know, how do we ensure that appropriate pedagogies and activities are being implemented across the curriculum? And I know that's a huge question that all schools battle with, but, you know, I think it's really something that we need to factor in. Okay, so as I mentioned, this will be continued because unfortunately there was not time to think of some of the strategies that we want to use in the classroom to develop these targets that we looked at. So keep your eyes peeled, make sure you're on the mailing list if you're interested, and that will hopefully be appearing later in the year. I think probably after the summer. And lastly, I don't know if there are any questions, Caroline, or there was some time.
Questions, Tom. I know you're very, very short of time, so it might be that you can, one of them in particular you might want to direct elsewhere. So one specifically about the international context and how the bands relate to the Common European Framework.
That's a really good question. Yes. Well, the short answer is they don't. Okay, they're not meant to be aligned in any way. And the reason for that simply is because they're doing different things, which is that the assessment frame, the CFR is there to assess students' general proficiency in English. Okay, that's just general. In the framework is assessing students' language use in the context of the curriculum specifically. And it might seem like that's not a big distinction, but it is a really important distinction because there are things that linguistically a student might do in a curriculum which are quite sophisticated, but which from a language point of view might be quite basic, and vice versa. So they're not really connected. Of course, there is a broad correlation, like a more advanced band user is going to be a more advanced CAFR user, generally speaking, but it doesn't map easily, unfortunately, onto each other. So you can't make that comparison directly. And as I mentioned before, I think it's not necessarily useful to kind of make those comparisons. Sometimes you want to address this, you want to look at where the learner is in terms of what they can do in the curriculum and focus your efforts on improving their language use in those contexts.
Thanks for that, Tom. That makes sense. And finally, a question from Carolina. So it's a question about the connection between primary and secondary. So is the secondary framework a continuation of the primary framework? And I think you have implicitly answered this.
Well, I mean, you might have something to add to this, but I would basically they're different, they're separate. And so if a learner is at a band, say D or E in primary, that does not necessarily mean they're going to be at a band D or E in secondary. In fact, it's quite likely they won't be, because as we mentioned, the bands have to span a really large area of child cognitive development. A 12-year-old, the difference between a 12-year-old and a 17-year-old is obviously very large, even more so at the primary level, going from early years up to a 12 or 11-year-old. So the bands are necessarily quite broad, and you wouldn't expect you have to start from basically you're assessing them with the new framework, the secondary framework, separately. It's not a continuation from the primary.
Tom, I've just seen a question has come in as well about linking back to the previous comments. So would it be confusing for colleagues to be given both bands and the levels?
I think, again, the band, the CFR bands are incredibly broad, right? So I think it's fine because the CFR band gives you a rough kind of idea of where a learner is, right? But as we know with CFR bands, and this is the same for the framework, learners, it's very rare that you just have a B1 learner, because they might be up, they're upper B1 in their speaking, they're A2 plus in their writing, they're or whatever, they have different levels. So ultimately it's about looking at what the student can do against the criteria that they're measuring them on. And the point of the framework is it's related directly to the tasks the students do in the classroom and the kind of tasks they do, not generic EFL tasks, which, you know, aren't necessarily very applicable in an academic context. You know, I mean, think of your average kind of IELTS exam or your Cambridge English proficiency exam, which have very sort of kind of slightly peculiar speaking tasks, which don't necessarily relate to the real world very well.
Thank you for that. I think that was really clear. I'm just looking at the time, and we've gone 5 minutes over, so not at all. So I hope you found that a useful presentation. So much to think about. And before we finish, I'll just let you know that there's some courses coming up. So Tom has shared those on a slide there. And a quick reminder that you'll get an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of the webinar, and you'll also get a link to the evaluation piece as well. So we'd be very grateful if you could spend a few moments just completing that to inform our own development. So thank you very much again for taking part in today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.